Have you ever sat down in your favorite chair, the house finally quiet, and felt like you just had nothing left to give? Not tired from walking, not tired from chores, but tired from people? It's a kind of weariness that doesn't come from your muscles. It comes from your spirit, your heart, your peace being slowly chipped away. And the strange thing is, it's not always loud. Sometimes it's not a fight, not an argument, not even a disagreement. It's just a presence in your life that leaves you feeling smaller every time they're around. Now, if you're over 60, maybe retired, maybe newly widowed, maybe just finally trying to enjoy a bit of space, you know this feeling all too well. You've spent decades taking care of others. Your children, your spouse, your family. You've sacrificed, given, adjusted, adapted. But here's a quiet truth I want to share with you today. Not everyone who stays in your life deserves a seat at your table. In this conversation, we're going to talk about the kinds of people who may not harm you outright, but who wear you down little by little, emotionally and spiritually. These people often look like friends, loved ones, even family, but they're draining you, quietly, consistently. And it's time to name them, recognize them, and most of all, reclaim your peace. Let's talk about the first one. And I want you to really listen to your gut here, because if someone's name or face comes to mind as I describe them, don't ignore that. That's your inner wisdom tapping you on the shoulder. So, let me ask you this. Have you ever had someone in your life who always seems to be suffering, always in crisis, always the victim of something or someone, but somehow you end up feeling guilty every time you speak to them? You could call them the eternal victim. They never raise their voice, they don't throw blame like a hammer, but they know how to sigh at just the right moment. How to mention the sacrifices they made. How to remind you, subtly, gently, that you were lucky and they weren't. That they've had it harder than you. And that you, maybe, owe them something for that. It might be a sibling, a child, an old friend. And they're not cruel. No, it's worse than that. They're emotionally needy in a way that manipulates you without saying so directly. You find yourself calling them back out of guilt, changing your plans to see them, apologizing for things you didn't do, giving them your energy over and over because you've come to believe that's your role, that it's your responsibility. But here's what's really happening. You're not helping them heal. You're enabling their pattern, because the eternal victim doesn't want to get better. They want to stay in that place where they hold emotional power over you through guilt. And the more you give, the more they feed on it. One woman from San Antonio once told me about her sister who had done this for decades. I thought I was helping her, she said. But really, I was keeping myself small so she wouldn't feel worse. And I lost years of my own peace in the process. That stuck with me. Because you don't notice it happening, not at first. But it builds. And I want to tell you something you may have forgotten. Real love doesn't drain you. It doesn't guilt you. It lifts you. So if someone is in your life who always needs rescuing, and you always feel smaller when you're with them, it's not love. It's emotional servitude. You have every right to care, to be kind, to listen, but not at the expense of your spirit. And if you're feeling that little knot in your chest when I talk about this, it might be time to step back, not with anger, not with blame, but with clarity. Now, the second kind of toxic person is even harder to see, because they often come wrapped in charm and kindness. They're the ones who say all the right things, who offer to help, who seem like the most supportive people in the room. But underneath their smiles is a quiet expectation that you owe them, that you should do things their way, that your choices need their approval. I call them the charming manipulator. You probably know someone like this. They don't shout. They don't push. They suggest. They advise. They make comments like, "Well, it's your choice, of course," or "I just want what's best for you." But when you go a different way, when you choose something they don't agree with, You feel it. The change in tone, the disappointment, the subtle, unspoken disapproval. Over time, this wears you down. You start second-guessing yourself, asking for permission without even realizing it. Should I buy that chair? Is it okay if I go on that trip? And you start living like a child again, tiptoeing around someone else's expectations. And maybe this person really does love you. Maybe they mean well. But love with strings attached isn't love. It's control. And no one, no matter how close, gets to control your life unless you hand them the keys. One woman from San Diego once wrote to me, "I don't know when I started asking everyone for permission just to live the way I want." That line broke my heart, because somewhere along the line, she had been trained to believe her choices needed approval, that she couldn't just live. She needed to be allowed. But here's the truth. You don't need permission to enjoy your own life. You've lived enough. You've earned your wisdom. You have the right to make decisions, small or big, without having to brace for someone's reaction. If you feel more confused, more drained, or more unsure of yourself after speaking to someone, even if they're smiling, even if they seem kind, take a step back. Ask yourself, am I growing around them or shrinking? You see, there's a big difference between advice and influence. One gives you strength. The other steals your clarity. And after 60, you deserve clarity. You deserve a home that feels safe, conversations that feel respectful, and relationships that honor who you've become, not who they want you to stay. You are not here to be emotionally managed. You are here to live. And if that means upsetting someone who's used to having quiet control over you, then let them be upset. Your peace matters more than their comfort. Now take a deep breath with me. You've already done the hardest part, opening your eyes to patterns that have been running quietly for years. That takes courage. That takes honesty. But that also opens the door to something beautiful, the ability to choose again. Because the next time someone offers you help, attention, or love, you'll know how to ask yourself the most important question. Does this come with freedom or conditions? There's something powerful that happens when you start asking better questions. When you stop just reacting and begin observing. You start noticing who actually nourishes your spirit and who slowly pulls it apart. Not with cruelty, not with chaos, but with patterns that feel normal, until one day you realize, I've been tired for years, and I thought it was just aging. But what if it's not age? What if it's people? You see, there's another kind of person who can darken your entire environment without ever raising their voice. You might not notice it the first time, or the fifth, but over time, it's like trying to breathe in a room where the windows never open. The air gets heavier, and you start wondering why even small joys feel out of reach. I'm talking about the professional pessimist, the one who, no matter what's happening, can always find the cloud. You tell them your grandson got into college and they say, well, good luck paying for it. You mention you're thinking about traveling, and they remind you how dangerous the world is now. You talk about a new friendship, and they raise an eyebrow and say, be careful, people always disappoint you. Now, at first, this kind of person might seem wise, like they've seen too much to be naive. And maybe you think, well, they've had a hard life. They've earned the right to be a little cynical. But here's what you need to know. Constant pessimism isn't wisdom. It's fear in disguise. And fear is contagious if you sit with it long enough. If every conversation you have with someone leaves you feeling less hopeful, less motivated, less curious about life, that's not harmless. That's emotional erosion. You might try to defend them in your head. They're just venting. That's just how they talk. I don't have to absorb it. But here's the truth. No matter how strong your spirit is, if you let someone speak defeat over your life every day, some of that will sink in. Not because you're weak, but because you're human. Words are like seeds. Even when you don't mean to plant them, they grow. So, if someone keeps planting fear, bitterness, or disappointment in your space, Don't be surprised if joy struggles to grow there. I've met so many women, and a few men too, who've told me, I used to laugh more, I used to make plans, I used to feel alive. And when we trace it back, they didn't lose that spark because of their body or their age. They lost it because of who they allowed into their world, day after day, without question. You can care about someone and still choose distance. You can listen with empathy, but still protect your atmosphere. You are not required to be the sponge for someone else's bitterness. And if you find yourself slipping into those habits too, always assuming the worst, always waiting for things to go wrong, ask yourself gently, whose voice am I echoing? And is it time to let that voice go? Because the truth is, your life is still happening. The world still has beauty. There are still things to see, conversations to enjoy, sunrises worth waking up for, and you deserve to experience all of it without the shadow of someone else's doom hovering over your shoulder. Now let's talk about a different kind of presence. One that doesn't shout or criticize, but somehow always makes you feel like you're on trial. You know who I mean. The silent judge. They don't need to say much. Just a glance when you speak. A long pause after you share an idea. A question with just the right tone. Oh, that's what you're wearing? You're eating that for dinner? You're still doing that at your age? They're not always mean. In fact, they might think they're being helpful. But something about the way they carry themselves makes you feel like your choices are always a little wrong. Like you're constantly being measured and found lacking. And the worst part? You don't even notice it at first. You just start editing yourself. You hold back stories. You hesitate before sharing good news. You make decisions, but deep down you wonder, will they approve? That's not respect. That's emotional imprisonment. The silent judge often hides behind roles we were taught to revere. An older sibling, a well-meaning daughter, a lifelong friend. But titles don't give people the right to shrink your confidence. And if you find yourself walking on eggshells around someone just to avoid their quiet disapproval, then it's time to ask, who really has the steering wheel in my life? It's easy to mistake silence for safety. To think they're not saying anything cruel, so it must be fine. But silence can be just as loud as words, especially when it carries the weight of judgment. You've lived through enough. You don't need anyone else's permission to be who you are. If someone hasn't walked beside you through your struggles, if they haven't cried with you through your losses, they don't get to comment on your growth. One of the most freeing things you can do, especially at this stage of life, is to take back your authority, your emotional sovereignty. To decide, I am no longer performing for anyone's approval. I live my truth. I trust my instincts. I choose peace. And let me remind you, peace is not selfish. It's sacred. And protecting your peace might mean disappointing someone who's used to you always playing small. Let them be disappointed. Your life isn't about their comfort. It's about your freedom. Now, sometimes judgment doesn't come from words or silence. Sometimes it comes from how someone treats your space. Not just your home, but your time, your routine, your privacy. I'm talking about the emotional intruder. The person who shows up without asking, who lingers too long, who treats your life as if it belongs to them too. Maybe it's a grown child who moved in for a little while, but never left. Maybe it's a neighbor who drops by every day, assuming you're always free. Maybe it's a friend who inserts themselves into your choices, what you eat, where you go, how you spend your money, as if they're managing your life like a committee. And the hard part is, it doesn't always come from a bad place. It might start with love, or loneliness, or habit, but eventually, you realize your days don't belong to you anymore. Your quiet mornings, gone. Your routines, constantly interrupted. Your peace, now shared property. And when you try to set boundaries, when you say no or ask for space, you're hit with guilt. You've changed. You're being selfish. I thought we were closer than that. And suddenly you're questioning yourself again. But let me say this clearly. You are allowed to have space. You are allowed to have time that belongs only to you. And you are not required to apologize for protecting it. Because when your home becomes everyone else's space, your identity begins to disappear. You stop hearing your own thoughts. You stop dreaming your own dreams. You become a supporting character in someone else's life. And that's not living. That's surrender. I know it's hard to draw lines, especially with people you love, especially when you've always been the one who made room for everyone else. But you can't wait for someone to give you permission to reclaim your life. You have to give that to yourself. Start with small steps. Close the door. Turn off the phone. Block out a time of day that belongs to no one but you. And when someone crosses your boundaries, don't defend yourself. Just stand firm. Because boundaries aren't about being cold. They're about being clear. And clarity is kindness to yourself and to others. You are not here to be endlessly available. You are here to be fully alive. There's a moment that comes, often quietly, where you pause in the middle of a conversation and ask yourself, how did I end up here again? Maybe you're sitting at the same table, listening to the same story, hearing the same complaints. Maybe you're nodding along out of habit, but inside, you feel smaller, heavier, like you've been cast in a role you no longer want to play. And sometimes the person across from you isn't loud, isn't mean, isn't even trying to manipulate you. In fact, they may be one of your closest companions. They've always been there, loyal, sympathetic, ready to remind you that yes, life has been hard, that people let you down, that dreams didn't work out. And over time, those shared stories of loss and unfairness become the glue between you. This is the resentful ally, the person who bonds with you not through joy, but through wounds. They nod every time you say life hasn't been fair. They agree that things never go your way. They say, "Me too," with a voice heavy with old hurt. And what starts as support slowly becomes a pattern of feeding each other's pain. You don't even notice it happening. It starts with reminiscing, then reliving, and before long, it becomes rehearsing. Rehearsing the same grievances, the same disappointments, until your conversations are less about connection and more about keeping old pain alive. And here's the danger. When your past becomes the center of your present, your future disappears. That's not healing. That's looping. We all need to grieve. We all need to be heard. But if the only thing you and someone else share is what went wrong, eventually that's all you can see. You stop noticing what's going right. You stop dreaming new dreams. You start believing that nothing will ever change because everything already went wrong. But it's not true. It's just repetition. And repetition is not reality. If you catch yourself talking about the same betrayal from 20 years ago, if every joyful moment gets pulled back into a memory of what could have been, if someone always takes you back to the hurt instead of lifting you forward, ask yourself, is this helping me live or keeping me stuck? And the hardest part? Sometimes the resentful ally is you. Sometimes we become that person for others, too afraid to move on, too attached to the past. We think loyalty means staying broken. But healing doesn't erase your story. It just adds new chapters. And you still have chapters to write. Someone once said, "The memory of pain should not steal the joy of what we still have." You have mornings, you have choices, and you deserve to live them without carrying yesterday's weight on your shoulders. Let go, not with bitterness, not with blame, but with peace. With love for the person you were when that pain first happened, and with compassion for the person you're still becoming. And now, we come to the seventh, the last and maybe the hardest to face. This person doesn't argue with you. They don't blame you. They don't even judge you. They simply need you, desperately, constantly, without end. I call them the weary redeemer, the one who sees you not as a companion, but as a savior. and they carry sadness like a cloak. They show up in your life with a story, maybe of abandonment, failure, depression, and your heart opens wide. You listen. You offer comfort. You give and give and give. But here's the pattern. They never rise. No matter how much love you offer, no matter how many times you show up, they stay in the same place. And eventually, you're not walking beside them anymore. You're carrying them, day after day. You cancel plans to help them. You lose sleep worrying about them. You feel responsible for their happiness. And when they don't improve, when nothing gets better, you feel like you failed them. But here's the truth, my friend. You are not here to save anyone. You can walk with someone. You can love them. But you cannot do their healing for them. And no one, no matter how broken, has the right to turn your life into their lifeboat. There's a difference between love and rescue, between compassion and self-abandonment. And if someone is drowning, yes, throw them a rope. But if they pull you in every time you reach out, eventually you have to ask, is this about their survival or my sacrifice? Too many people, especially women, were raised to believe that being good means always being needed, that your worth is tied to how much you give. But being needed isn't the same as being valued. And being selfless doesn't mean being invisible. You matter. Your peace matters. Your time matters. And if someone is always taking and never growing, then what you're giving them isn't help. It's a hiding place from their own growth. I say this with love. It's okay to stop saving everyone. Because when you finally stop trying to fix everyone else, you might just realize how much of yourself you've been neglecting, how tired you've become, and how desperately you need the same care you keep pouring into others. This is not selfish. It's sacred. It's the moment you stop bleeding energy for others and start nourishing your own soul again. Now take a breath. Sit back. Feel your feet on the ground. Because if you've listened this far, you already know. Something has to change. Not because you're angry, not because you hate anyone, but because your life still has meaning, still has purpose, still has so much left to say. You've seen the patterns. You've recognized the faces, and maybe you've seen yourself in these stories too. But now you have a choice. You can keep living in quiet exhaustion, in polite obligation, in routines that don't feed you, or you can begin the brave work of choosing peace. You don't need to confront anyone. You don't need to explain yourself to everyone, but you do need to decide that your space, your emotional, spiritual, physical space, is sacred. And if someone's presence makes you feel guilty, small, drained, or constantly responsible, it's time to set a boundary. A gentle one, a firm one that says, I love you, but I love myself too. You deserve mornings that begin in calm, afternoons that aren't interrupted by crisis, conversations that leave you feeling uplifted, a home that belongs to you, not to old ghosts or emotional squatters. You deserve joy, not someday, but now. And that joy begins the moment you realize you don't have to keep everyone else afloat to keep your soul alive. So, if this message spoke to you, I invite you to write something simple in the comments below. My space is sacred. Let the world know that you're no longer available for quiet toxicity, for manipulative kindness, for heavy silences. You are available for peace, for clarity, for freedom, for love that lifts instead of love that drains. And if this conversation made you think or cry or breathe just a little easier, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone you care about, because one sentence at the right time can change everything. This isn't just a video. It's a declaration, a quiet revolution, a moment of awakening. You are not here to survive the rest of your life. You are here to live it, with grace, with courage, with joy. If you haven't already, click like, subscribe to Strong Elderly Life, and become part of a community that honors who you are, not just what you do for others. You've given enough. Now it's your turn. Here's to protecting your peace, honoring your worth, and finally, coming home to yourself.